Let me start tonight with a personal story. Some of you, like myself, may have a beautiful garden at home, and I do. Many times I sit on the patio with my wife and we look out at the garden and we admire it for its harmony and beauty, and we think to ourselves, boy, you know, this just doesn't happen all by itself. This actually takes work. And a lot of you also maybe are tending to your gardens. I know when I mow and I weed and I pull the weeds and things like that and trim, there is a certain sense of satisfaction, and you look at it and you think, wow, this is kind of the fruits of my labor. It's kind of nice. One day I was thinking about all the work that goes into maintaining a beautiful garden. And I had an epiphany, which was, you know what? That kind of feels like what we have to do as Scrum Masters as well. How we tend to our Agile Garden, as opposed to just our literal garden in the backyard. I want to give credit where credit is due here. The title of this presentation is not mine. I took it from a movie. I've actually never seen this movie, called The Constant Gardener. It was a movie that came out in 2005. Some of you may have seen it. And the relationship to the story is that the character played by Ralph Fiennes is a British diplomat stationed in Africa, and he's also an amateur horticulturist. So a means of relieving stress and anxiety for him is to tend to a very large garden that he has down there. It takes his mind off of the stress of his job and lets him just play in the garden a little bit and have fun. So that's where this title comes from, but the material is all original. Now it's your turn. I'd like each of you to think about a healthy, vibrant, harmonious garden. I'll give you a couple of examples here, but I want you to think about this in your mind. And maybe you've been to a castle somewhere in Europe, or maybe you envy your neighbor down the street. A lot of different things come into play. But when you think about a beautiful garden that has balance, what are some of the things that you think of? Let me hear you. What are some of the important elements of a healthy garden?
Sunlight.
Keeping the weeds from taking over.
Sunshine, yes. Protecting from the weeds. What else?
Variety.
Variety.
Water.
Yes, beautiful. Gardens have to have water. What else?
Oil.
Probably a lot of things that you're thinking of. Sorry, go ahead.
Gardeners.
Caretakers, yes, absolutely. Well, these examples here, the reason why I pulled these is because what I see is balance. Not necessarily symmetry, but balance. And a lot of you probably did think of a water source, certainly. But I was thinking, what if you have a garden or a yard, let's say, that has nothing more than rose bushes? Is that really a garden? No, I don't think so. It's just a yard full of rose bushes, that's it. So part of, in my mind, what makes a healthy, harmonious garden, why I use that term on purpose, is because you do want to have the balance that you talked about. You want to have different types of plants that maybe flower different times of the year. That's always nice. Different kinds of trees that have different fruits, or vegetable bar gardens, for example, or different color schemes, or different things that attract different animals, for example. So all these things about balance and harmony, I think, are key in order to having a healthy garden. Think about that as we go forward. Now I will paraphrase one of the most common nursery rhymes or stories that you've heard as a kid, which was the Mary, Mary, quite contrary, but in this case, it's Scrum Master Mary. Scrum Master Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow? And that means that we've looked at an initial plant garden, and we've talked about all the different components of that. But how do you translate that balance and that symmetry and that harmony to what we all do as professional Scrum Masters? How do we cultivate our own Agile garden? I was thinking about a concept that you've heard before. It's not really a joke, but there's a question that is often put to teams, and people in general, which says, how high does a tree grow? The answer is as tall as it possibly can. That means that all the animals and all the plants are always striving for their fullest expression. They don't hide in a corner. They don't say to themselves, I'm only going to grow to half of my potential or something like that. And this is what I want in my Agile teams, and hopefully you do too. If we have any yoga practitioners out there on this call, and you've done a yoga practice, you may remember the instructor saying to you, strike this pose to your fullest expression. That doesn't mean that you have to look just like the instructor does or your neighbor. It means for you, find the fullest expression of that particular pose for you. Now, to me, this means that we want people on the teams that we support, our Scrum teams, to fully express themselves. We want people who are engaged. We want people who are not afraid to grow, to learn, to develop. We don't want people who are somehow self-limiting in any way. And this is, for me, also a beautiful metaphor for what I want in an Agile Garden, and hopefully you do too, is full of people who are willing to fully express themselves at all times. What does it take to cultivate that kind of garden? You called out some of these, but there are 6 different elements that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Clean air, or clean water is the first one. Clean air, sunshine, nourishment. The next one all goes together, which is mowing, trimming, pruning, and weeding. The last one is consistent love and attention. You may have some other ones that you think of throughout this. And as we go through each one of these, I'm going to ask you at the end to talk about what this means to you, because you may have a little bit of a different impression than I do. You may have some other thoughts. And in the spirit of collaboration in this very active and dynamic Agile coach community, if you have some other ideas that you can share with me or with the rest of the group, then I certainly want to encourage you to do that. But these are the different categories that we're going to be talking about. The first one is clean water, hence the blue in the title there. Strong Agile teams need an environment with plenty of quote unquote water. Now, what is water as it relates to an Agile team? I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure I have the best metaphor here, but I hope you can help me out. Water is a medium, and everything flows through that medium. In fact, when you were picturing the ideal garden in your mind, many of you probably thought of maybe a fountain, or perhaps a little pond, or a little brook that runs through the garden in some way. But almost all of you probably identify a healthy garden with a healthy source of water as well. We do need to make sure that it's clean, healthy water and not polluted water, because nobody wants that. What does this mean? For me, this medium, this space in which we all live, relates to things like trust, vulnerability, collaboration. That's the first bullet. The second bullet point, some of you may recognize, are the 5 Scrum values: focus, courage, respect, openness, and commitment. The third bullet there relates, as some of you also may know, to the Agile pillars: inspection, adaptation, and transparency. It's basically, do we live Agile? Do we speak agility? And to me, that's what the clean water represents. It's all the things that we do to create a healthy, strong environment. That's the medium, is this level of trust, this attitude, the mood, the vibe, whatever you want to call it. That's, I think, the most important thing. What's our responsibility? I think it's to set an example of this medium through which all of your team members flow. If different animals come to the garden and they know that they always have a consistent source of clean water, that's what I want the members of my Scrum teams to know. When they come to the ceremonies where I'm the Scrum Master, or to me personally, I want to be that clean water that represents all the things that we see on the screen here. But what about you? When all of you on the call think of what clean water represents to your Scrum teams, what do you think of?
Grant, could we perhaps make a connection between this environment and the culture?
Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that.
Well, you look like you're covering a lot of ground with this metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if it could be summed up a little bit more concisely.
I think culture is a great word. I use lots of other ones like environment or mood or things like that, but you know what? That's as good as any that I picked. Good job. What else? Anybody else have any thoughts on what clean water represents to you?
Yeah, this is Lori. So, and I think whoever mentioned that, drawing the connection between the garden and the environment or the cultural environment at work is very strong. So this metaphor, what that means to me is that when we look at these different components, water, air, nourishment, and we directly relate those to the culture and environment that we have for our teams, there's really easy ways to identify maybe when we're having problems in those areas because the water gets polluted, right? And you can tell it's not clear. It smells bad. Animals, bugs are not present. Frogs are not around. Those are really good indicators that like something is wrong with our environment, our actual literal environment. And what do we hone in on to figure out maybe what's wrong there? Mm-hmm. And if we went back and, we use this metaphor like, yeah, our water is stale or it's corrupted. Where are we failing in these areas?
Exactly. Where's the culture falling short? Mm-hmm. Great example. Thank you, Lori. What else?
I think of it as a foundation. From the garden metaphor aspect, the water feature is often the central feature or the central foundation that the garden is kind of built around. Mm-hmm. So from a Scrum team, the clean water would be kind of that, or any Agile team really, is that clean water is the base of the team and what you use to start and establish the team.
Mm-hmm. It's always flowing too. Let's think about how water flows. And you mentioned a fountain. I think it's a good way to start this. I think about what are the different sources of water in a garden. And one of them, which is pretty common, is a fountain. This to me is a little bit more direct. It's a bit more immediate, a bit more prominent. And that could be something like you're taking an Agile class or a workshop or something that's very focused, such as a ceremony, for example. But then you also have the drip line, which is a bit more hidden. It provides water as well, but with much more subtlety. It just comes out a little bit at a time. And that to me is this kind of stuff that happens in between all the ceremonies. It's just this whole cultural aspect that was referred to earlier of, do I feel safe in this environment? Am I able to express myself? Do we have a healthy mix of people? All the things that relate to this. So it doesn't have to be something that's in your face and big and robust all the time. It can be something that's just very subtle, sort of in the background. And that's another point that I wanted to make with this water source is, to the extent that you can do that, you can be both a fountain and you can be the drip line as well.
I'd like to add that, extending the metaphor, clean water when stagnant becomes polluted and dirty water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Lori alluded to that. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it also reflects the healthy flow of emotions through a team, because you will have emotions as a team. And if you allow them to stagnate, positive or negative, it'll lead to issues. But if you let a clean flow continue, even the positive and negative emotions as team members recognize them, address them, and let them flow past, you can keep it in a healthy environment.
Mm-hmm. That's a great extension of the metaphor. Appreciate that. You're right. Healthy water is flowing water. And you have to have this consistent attitude, that this undertone that flows through the entire team at all times in order to keep it healthy and strong. Great point. Let's talk about the next one. It's very similar. This one is about clean air. And when I think about this one, I use the analogy of psychological air. A lot of you have heard this term before. It's really, in my mind, the security that team members have to provide honest input and feedback, even if it's negative, without fear of any kind of reprisal or retribution. We talk about this a lot. Again, it speaks to culture very much, is do people feel safe? Psychological safety. Air can also be polluted, just like water. And like water, air is really all-encompassing. So you can't really have polluted air over on one side of the garden without it affecting the entire garden. And what that means to me is if you have one person on your team who is constantly confrontational, or they're late to meetings all the time, or they don't give any kind of meaningful report and stand-ups, or they're on their cell phone in a meeting, or whatever, activity or behavior you want to think of, if they're doing that, it can't but affect the entire team. So whether you have dirty water that's stagnant or whether you have polluted air, you really have to think about what that means and how to get rid of that to create the entire environment of cleanliness. I also wanted to point out that in my mind, this is not limited to just the ceremonies. When we talk about psychological air and the freedom to express oneself, we often talk about that within the context of the retrospective ceremony. That's probably the most common place we talk about giving feedback, but I want to encourage all of you, if you don't already, to allow for that really at all times. It can be in another ceremony, it can be in another meeting, and it could be with another Scrum team. Some of you on this call mentioned SAFE, and if you're using the SAFE framework and you have an art sync call, for example, or if you have a meeting that you attend that's part of another group for their backlog refinement or something like that, I want a kind of environment where people are feeling free to express themselves as well. You don't want to do it in a disruptive way. We all know that. You don't want to do it in a confrontational way. But if we all have the right intent, the prime directive, where we show up every day intending to do our best work, and we can be honest, then that keeps not only the air of our garden, let's say, clean, but of the entire block or the entire city. So what do you think? When you think of clean air in your garden, what does that mean to you?
I like where you're at with clean air being about psychological safety, and just a little bit of science behind it. In a knowledge-based workforce, which is what all Scrum teams are, you're looking for what's in someone's brain and the connections they can create. And from a psychological perspective, if you don't feel safe, and you don't not just feel physically safe, but emotionally and mentally safe, you can't access the executive functions of your brain. And that's what we're looking for out of developers, testers, and that's what we're looking for out of knowledge-based workers, is those connections that no one else has that skill set or knowledge to be able to address.
Mm-hmm. Great point. What else?
Totally agree with that. I've been using the idea of emotional blockers. And so if you're creating, I don't know if you think of air, some sort of conductivity or ether that allows things to flow, you're providing that psychologically safe space for people to connect, or at least to allow those higher level functions to flow. So if they do get shut down, it is a blocker.
Absolutely. Good call, Catherine. What else?
I just thought of this, trying to make an actual physical connection between air and not having psychological safety or security. That whole atmosphere of having polluted air or the ability to provide feedback without retribution. I get tight in the chest just thinking about it, and my breathing actually is inhibited. And I felt that. And so I just kind of made the connection now. It's like, oh gosh, yeah, when that stuff happens, I even have a hard time physically actually breathing.
That's true. It's a great point. And we also use a lot of expressions about things like the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. We've all used that expression before, even though it makes no sense literally. But what we mean is that the air was so heavy, so polluted, so congested, or whatever other adjective you want to throw in there, is that it limits natural function. You can't breathe, and you do have a physical or a physiological reaction when you have this choking air. Some of you may remember the days, I do, when you could fly in an airline and they had smoking and non-smoking. Of course, there was no such thing because the smoking section would just waft all the way back to the rest of the plane, and we were all sitting in the smoking section. But if you've ever been in a city with a ton of smog, or a bus goes by and the exhaust comes out, yeah, that's polluted, congested air, and you have a physical reaction to it. And the same thing with your team. You want to provide this clean, fresh air. They have that psychological space and safety to say what they want. And be honest and transparent. And that's what we should want out of them as Scrum Masters. Anything else on air? Let's talk about sunshine. One of my favorites here. I'm trying to stick with some color themes here. So my beautiful golden color here is sunshine. How do you shine light on your teams? Is it a healing energy that helps to nourish and sustain growth? Or is it maybe a laser beam of burning light that withers its target? Is it a warm spotlight that showcases accomplishments with an opportunity to praise? Or is it more of a penetrating spotlight to identify an opportunity to coach? There are a lot of different ways that light can affect a team. And I think Einstein, didn't he say that light is both energy and a wave? If I remember correctly, it's really two different things at the same time. And this is such a beautiful metaphor. I think about
particle or wave.
And a wave. Okay, thank you. Appreciate the
Sure.
correction for my science background there. But sunshine is something that every garden needs. But we all know that not every plant wants sun all day long. You've got your partial shade, your full shade, things like that. And this is what I think of our job is to provide just the right amount of sunshine. I thought of a story from Star Trek, The Next Generation. If you're any fans out there, you can correct me if I don't have all the right facts here, but I think I'll make my point okay. There was an episode once when the Starship Enterprise went to some planet, and on the planet was a building of some sort. People were walking through it. It wasn't really housing. It was just sort of like a place to walk through with hallways and passages and so forth. As it turns out, it was a living entity. And it was kind of like a shape-shifting entity. It could take on whatever kind of shape it wanted. The people on the planet were basically holding this being hostage by only giving it the minimum amount of energy needed to maintain its shape, but not to go fly back into space. So what the Enterprise did was, with their phasers, they just shot down this very low level energy beam to this entity. It gained more and more and more strength and energy. And finally, it had enough strength on its own to then go back into space and join its other aliens. Now, if you don't like Star Trek, forget the corny example, but the idea is that's what we should be. We want to shine just the right amount of energetic, nourishing sunshine on our individuals or on our teams until we get that feedback. And teams will tell you, I think, whether it's verbal or not, whether you're giving them not enough or too much. So you'll know with your team when to back off. But I love that example of shining the light on something that is wonderful to praise people, or on occasion we'll shine light on anti-patterns that need to be corrected or coach. All right, your turn now. When you think of this metaphor of sunshine, what do you think of?
So I would agree with the metaphor for energy and perhaps positive energy, so that your team, if it's bogged down, if there's too much negativity in the team, then the Scrum Master could sort of get the team out of that mindset, and by perhaps acknowledging the positive aspects of the team and the work they've been doing.
Sounds good. Thank you, Steve. What else?
I think of the value of transparency.
Mm-hmm.
So sunshine makes me think of shining a light, right, in dark places.
Mm-hmm.
So from a direct Scrum Master, posting artifacts and whatnot visibly for all to see.
I love it. Yep, great example. Anything else?
I think the thing for me and my team is really bringing the attention of what the team is doing and what they're contributing to the larger organization, and not just within the team or the closest stakeholders, but how are we contributing to our overall customers and stakeholders, and what is our overall impact to society in some cases. So I think if we can really highlight that, that's really some nourishment for the team.
Mm-hmm. I love that example of, think of either maybe a flashlight or a laser beam where you can adjust the intensity and also the dispersion, if that's the right word, of that light. Do you want to illuminate the entire cave or the entire room or the entire team in this example? Or do you want to just focus a very narrow beam of light on one thing? One person, one ceremony, one response, one relationship. You can do all that within this concept of sunshine. And that's part of our job, is to know what level of light, what intensity of light to shine where and when and how, as far as illuminating the right thing. I think that's a real magic to our role, is to know how to do that. Anything else on sunshine? Let's talk about nourishment. This one's a pretty broad category, obviously, and I picked the color of a grapefruit or a papaya or something orange here, guava maybe, looks good. Strong Agile teams need a nourishing environment in which they receive food for both emotional and professional development. There are lots of different ways that you can do this, of course, and this is part of the magic, I think, of the Scrum Master role as well, is how do we feed our people? One way to do that is through, for example, team building exercises or maybe offsite activities. If you're into SAFE as well, you can use the IP sprint or hackathons. A lot of people within Aetna, and probably those of you on the call as well, are doing virtual happy hours online, people to just come and hang out, for example. So all these are great opportunities to provide nourishment for the team. For me, this translates to things like, do you know the birthdays of the members of your team? Do you know their spouses' names, their children's names, their pets' names, for example? Do you know some of their hobbies and passions outside of work? And more importantly, are you willing to engage with them on occasion just to listen and learn? Just to have a nice social conversation around something that they're interested in without having to push your agenda. Stephen Covey says, seek first to understand, then to be understood, one of his habits. And I think that's so important with what we do, because we're about developing and nourishing our team members. To me, one of the most important things that a Scrum Master can do is to develop people on the teams that you support, to make them better, both as individuals, as professionals. So in any way you can provide nourishment to them, in whatever shape that takes, I think should be part of our role. What about you? What do you think of when you think of nourishment for your teams?
I think training classes may be another form of nourishment. Perhaps advanced Scrum Master, or going to conferences such as Mile High Agile would fall into this category. And certainly it's very important for the development of your team, and I think it's appreciated by a lot of the developers and team members.
Absolutely. Professional development is critical for everybody. What else?
I'm thinking of one-on-ones that I have with team members to get to know them a little bit better. Really, my objective is to listen to them without an agenda, just to learn a little bit more about what they're interested in, where that development comes in. Sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with, our work or their code, or be that they like to cook or they like to ski, or, or they're looking for, people that live near them that have similar interests because they just moved here. All those things that we find out about folks, that we can, just show them that we have a mutual interest in caring about each other. That's what makes the community, rather than just a group of people. And the other thing that came to mind when you mentioned this, it's kind of funny, in the very literal sense of feeding people. I found this pretty powerful. I will never forget the one time that I brought in breakfast burritos for my teams, and I had made a lot of breakfast burritos. So I knew that there would be extras for, whoever might be interested. And we had a great, time having breakfast together. And then there were some leftover breakfast burritos, and then I put in the refrigerator. And the next day I came in, and I'm coming into the office. I'm walking down the hallway, and this very understated, kind of quiet guy that I work with is literally running down the hall with a breakfast burrito and a piece of foil above his head. And he runs past me and he says, "Lucky!" And I just went, "Okay." And the person that was behind him, I said, "What is going on there?" He goes, "Oh, he just nabbed the last of the breakfast burritos." And he was running away from somebody that was trying to take it from him. So, I felt at that moment that they knew that, I had put some effort into doing something that was literally nourishing and feeding, and just that coming together over food can be one of these exercises that we do to kind of come together.
I think that's why many companies bring in food for the teams, once a week. Edna did that before we all were working from home, and it's just a good chance to connect with people whom you don't normally see, a different floor, maybe a different department. So that's certainly a good option there. The other thing that I think is worth stressing is you want to do this organically. You have plenty of opportunity. In fact, even more, I think, now when we're working remotely, because this happens all the time. Think about it. You're on a Zoom call or WebEx or whatever, and you see things in the background. Maybe their spouse walks by, or their cat jumps on their desk, or the dog is barking. And you have a really easy way to say, "Oh, who's that in the background?" They say, "Oh, that's my dog Sparky." Or, "Oh, I see your daughter just walked by." And they say, "Oh yeah, that's Susan. She just turned 5 next week," or something like that. And if you're smart, you write that down. And next time you're in your one-on-one, you say, oh yeah, you mentioned your daughter Susan just had her 5th birthday or something. Is that right? And just to make those connections like that, believe me, that goes a long way for this nourishment of that relationship that we were talking about. Anything else on nourishment? The next one can be a little bit challenging, certainly, when we talk about trimming, mowing, weeding, or pruning. Strong Agile teams need a leader who recognizes individual needs and talents and helps those individuals find their sweet spot. This speaks a little bit to the last slide about how we nourish people, how we develop people, but helping them to find their sweet spot. That's a term that I use quite a bit. And same with your garden. You don't want to mow the grass too low because it burns. You don't want it too long. You don't want to trim too much off the tree. You know, just, you want to shape things. Just find the right sweet spot. But some other metaphors to extend this point is, who on your team is a full sun or partial sun or a full shade kind of person? Who's an annual bloomer versus a perennial bloomer? Who is a weed that needs uprooting? Sometimes you have those. And who needs a little trimming or some outright mowing? How about transplanting? This is a great example because many of you have probably had an experience, and maybe it's with each of you personally, where you realize you just didn't fit on that team or in that department or in that role. Well, as Scrum Masters, as leaders, I think part of our role is to help people identify, what are you good at? What are your natural strengths? Where can you bloom? In fact, we often use that term, you know, what's the kind of role where you can bloom? And maybe that means moving them to a different team. Maybe it means putting them on a different role, for example. So it's not always binary where the person fits or they don't, and that means that they're going to get fired. It means, maybe this person just needs a different amount of shade over there in that department where they can grow and bloom. How about this last one? Do you have any invasive species choking off the rest of the garden? Maybe you have a brand new person on the team who just comes on like a proverbial bull in the china shop. They're just dominating everything. They're choking off the rest of the team, not giving anybody a chance to speak. Well, you are a gardener. You're a caretaker. So you need to monitor these kinds of things and figure out, how can I control and in some cases restore the balance and the harmony of the garden? Because that's the most important thing, right? We talked about this in other contexts beyond just this particular presentation tonight, is having everybody in the right spot. I think, what's his name? The guy that wrote Good to Great and Built to Last, Jim Collins. He said one of the most important things for team success and company success is that bus analogy. He says you need to have everybody on the same bus in the correct seat, all going the same direction. And that speaks of this idea of harmony, is everybody's doing the same thing, but not everybody has exactly the same skill set. You have complementary skill sets. That's what's key here. What about you? When you think of how you would prune or trim or weed your garden, what do you think of?
I think of a very toxic team member I had that I worked to mitigate. So I guess pruning as it sprouted, but also worked very diligently to raise awareness with management that, you know, while technically skilled, they were destroying the rest of their team members.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my yard, many dandelions are beautiful, right? Yellow color, nice flower, but right, they're weeds and you don't want them. They may look good at the beginning, but they can take over. Yep, what else?
Yeah, by the title, this does imply that perhaps you're going to move somebody out of the team that is not compatible with the team. And so it does have, I think that certainly is a reality. And, how do you go about moving that individual out, or perhaps changing their behavior so it is more compatible with the team?
Mm-hmm. We often use this expression to nip something in the bud, another gardening analogy. And that's so true with people. Before this weed can grow and take over the garden, you want to nip it. And that's part of our coaching role, is how do we, steer somebody the right way. And you can do that through pruning and trimming, as you can help guide a plant in a certain direction. So it goes more to the left or the right or the sun or the shade or something like that. So we have the ability through our coaching and our mentorship and our leadership to really help guide and steer some of these plants in our Agile Garden towards success. What else on this one?
I think it's worth looking at this not just as a who, but a what. Maybe there's a practice that, and it applies more so to teams that don't, maybe more mature teams that aren't strictly following a singular framework anymore, that have maybe grown past that in their journey. But I think, what if there's a process? What if there's a methodology? What if there's a practice that needs trimming or pruning or weeding, not just people?
Great point. Yes. Anything else?
Well, just identifying someone as a weed, I think that's pretty negative. I would steer away from. If you want to say a particular behavior is a weed, or a process step is a weed, then that's fine. But saying that a particular individual is a weed.
Certainly in your annual performance evaluations, don't call people weeds. Okay, let's not do that.
Agreed.
Good point, Steve. Thank you. Anything else on this one? The last of the 6 elements to a healthy Agile garden is consistent love and attention. That's the red for the heart. And we all know what kind of love this means. It's more parental love is what I think of. Many people, even if they're my same age on my team, I still think of myself as kind of a parent. And I want to help my children grow and develop and learn and blossom and all these other kinds of things. So it's this genuine, authentic caring for people. One of my favorite quotes is here, which says, "Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care." What are some of the things that you can do? You can improve your emotional intelligence, or EQ, your relationship skills. You can build up your emotional bank account. Also comes from Stephen Covey. Emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman, of course, who wrote that book. I mentioned this earlier. Do you know birthdays, names of spouses, kids, for example, things like that? Do you ask about their hobbies with no agenda? These are ways that, parents cultivate relationships with their families. There's no agenda. There's no hidden meaning. It's just a authentic, genuine exchange of ideas and laughter and talking about whatever. Be a leader based upon setting examples of supporting, protecting, and defending your team. So much of the success of the Scrum Master role, I believe, is about credibility. Does your team believe what you say? Do you walk the walk and talk the talk, as they say? And when we tell people, hey, we want open, honest, transparent exchange, and we want you to feel safe, and we want you to be able to fail and they do that, do you back them up? Because if you don't, oh boy, it's going to take a long time to restore that credibility and that trust. And that's where it all starts. So if you can demonstrate and set an example to them of the things that you do in your role, then they will come to learn that, yeah, this person, you know, does what he says, and that's what I want. This last one is also another important component here of how we build love and attention and belonging. Some of the Scrum Masters on this call from Ed, I just read a book recently as a group project, if you will. It's called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. He says that of the three components that create very strong, successful teams is belonging. It's a sense of identity or community. He talks about a professional basketball team. He talks about military units and other groups who are very, very tight-knit, and they would really do anything for each other. Why is that? Because they have such a strong sense of family and belonging. If you can do that with your Scrum teams as well, fantastic. But it takes work. You know, you have to be present as well. You have to be engaged as well. Again, back to the example, I think that one of the most important things and effective things that we can do is set an example of the kind of behavior that we want from our teams. That lets everybody know this is the standard. This is the culture. All right, what about you? When you think of love and attention for your teams, what does that mean to you?
Feels similar to nourishment, and like what that makes me think of is just like acknowledging and connecting with the whole person, treating them as a whole, acknowledging there's an other side of their life than work, and then connecting with them. Like it's kind of hard to listen to someone when you don't respect them or think they really have your best interests at heart, but like having that connection first, I think makes people open up more to hearing you when you have something difficult to deliver. Mm-hmm.
One of my mentors is actually on this call, Matt Fishencord, and I'm going to give him some love and attention here. And one of the things he first taught me was win the hearts and minds of your people. And that's so true. Catherine, it's just what you said. Connect with them initially, relate to them personally, build that foundation, and then it's so much easier from that point to then build the other relationships. Great point. Anything else?
Yeah, this is Lori. We've had this is a weighted subject for me because it is so vital. And I think that the Agile community especially has been pretty good at adopting this idea of love in the workplace and what does that mean and is it appropriate. So I went through kind of like a stage of like self-realization about loving people that I work with. And when I opened myself up spiritually to doing that, I kind of had this discussion with God and said, do I have to love people that I'm working with and I'm mentoring? And the answer was, yeah, you have to love them. And I said, no, can I just really like them a lot? No, you have to love them. And it has to be authentic, because if you fake this thing, that can do a lot of damage. And like Catherine is saying, you build this trust, you get someone's approval to actually have this quote affection or attention to them. And some people are not okay with that. And sometimes it hurts when you don't get a response that's similar or mutual. And so you have to learn that, it's okay for that to be one-sided. Like that's not going to stop me loving people that I work with and treating them with the respect and the way that I would want them to maybe return that. But it's also a little difficult because, you might not get that back. Or you might be really puzzled about why people would not be willing to accept that from you. And sometimes you just have to let that go and just continue to do what you know is right. But yeah, that whole thing about it being authentic is so important, because if somebody smells that you are faking it, wow, you can never really recover entirely, I think. So it's best to, wait until you're ready for that, and understand what your intention is behind it.
Yep, great point.
That's like an expert coach. Like, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, to me, this kind of brings up the concept of servant leadership. And yeah, you're there to assist the team and remove blockers and sort of be that liaison with the rest of the company. And in so doing, you show your concern, you show your interest in the team, and the team, it can acknowledge that. In many cases, they may not, which is, then you're falling into this, where you don't feel appreciated for all the things that you are doing for the team. But yeah, I mean, that is certainly, a pretty standard pattern. I mean, the team moves forward. Maybe you don't get the pat on the back that you are expecting.
That is actually a beautiful, sorry, Laura, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say that it shows a certain vulnerability, though, that we're willing to go and put our emotions on the line for this team or for this group or for this person. And so it sets the standard as well, that folks know, hey, you just joined a team that's high performing, and one of the values is that we love and care for each other. If you can't hack that, then maybe this isn't the right thing for you. Or maybe, let's figure out how you can step up and actually, be a contributor to that. So, but yeah, just even the fact that you're putting it out there and like making your best effort and modeling those behaviors, I think gives other people strength and courage to do the same.
Yep, lead by example, whether it's vulnerability or something else. Steve, your comment about servant leadership was really a fantastic segue to this next to last slide here about constant maintenance. Think back when we started, when I asked you to envision this beautiful garden in your mind. Maybe you have that picture as well. What strikes me, which is to your point, Steve, is that when you walk into a palace or a castle or some garden that is immaculate, it's beautiful, do you really think to yourself, oh, this just happens all by itself? Some people do. They think, oh, it just grows this way. And what we know is that to get that result, it requires constant maintenance. This is what I've realized at home with, every day, every couple of days you're out there, you're watering all the time, you're weeding, you're pruning, you're cutting off a couple little small branches of the tree or whatever you're doing. But if you just leave it and think, oh, it's perfect now, so I never have to tend to it again, we all know that's a recipe for a disaster. So I want to make sure you all understand, and you do, that it takes constant maintenance. One of my favorite expressions is first the roots, then the fruits. People say, well, how come this tree is not producing oranges or walnuts or guavas or bananas? Or how come these flowers aren't blooming? Well, my suggestion to you is if you are having trouble with the output, I want you to re-examine the input. What are you doing to provide nourishment, air, water, sunshine, love and attention to all the team so that you can then bear the fruits. First you sow, then you reap, right? Is that what they say? Also, it's what you don't see that's just as important sometimes. This is this concept of putting ourselves out of a job. We talk about this a lot, is how much energy and how much attention do Scrum teams actually need? The higher performance they are, the higher they get on the maturity level, the less input they probably need from people like us. But it doesn't mean that you can just forget them or neglect them. Just like a garden. When it gets to the point when it's a high performing garden, you got the balance over here, things are in full bloom over there, different colors over here, everybody's in the spot, whether it's full shade or full sun or partial. Once you've got all that dialed in and your team is just humming along, then it takes less maintenance. That's true, but it still takes work. Gardens need tending. And this last one I have to give to Lori. Be a caretaker of your team. That's such a beautiful word that really summarizes what we're talking about. You have to take care of your team. Be that person who tends your flock of sheep, or in this case, tends your garden. Let me close with a couple of things that I think are also representative of this discussion, but really go beyond just this. They're both about books. I love business books. First one is Carol Dweck, wrote a book called Mindset. And she talks about fixed mindset and growth mindset. You've probably all heard this before, but the fixed mindset, if you haven't, basically says, oh, I'm never going to improve. I can never learn math. Maybe you've heard this from your kids. You know, I can never be that smart, or I can never be good in business, or I can never learn to play soccer, or whatever it is. You know, I can never develop. Whereas the growth mindset says, oh yeah, I can always learn something new. I can always improve. And all of us on this call do that all the time, whether it's learning safe, whether it's getting certifications, taking classes, developing our own emotional bank account, emotional intelligence, all these things that we need to be successful. So never forget to have a growth mindset. The other book is back to my 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, when Stephen Covey talks about the scarcity mentality and the abundance mentality. The scarcity mentality, he says, is people think of there's only one pie, the pie is only so big, and the bigger piece you have means a smaller piece I have. It's a zero-sum game. There's only so much to go around, and I have to fight and compete with everybody else to get my fair share of the pie. He says an abundance mentality is one in which the pie is big enough for everybody and it's ever expanding. It continues to grow. There's plenty of pie for everybody. What that means is I don't have to hoard my ideas, hoard my knowledge. John Maxwell in his books on leadership says, give your power away. And that means, why should I not tell a colleague something that is a great nugget of information? Why should I just keep all the good stuff to myself? Because making somebody else better does not diminish me. That's such a powerful concept in life and this job, anything that you do, is making other people around you better makes you better. That's the point. So when you're tending your Agile Garden and you're making people on your team better by giving them opportunities for leadership and development and ways to be better teammates, better communicators, all these things that you can impart through coaching and mentoring and one-on-ones and happy hours, that's what we should be doing. Don't restrict that. You have to give it to them in doses that they can digest and use and grow. But that's such a powerful concept to me, and I want to leave this conversation on that note of all of you being willing to share what you know, give your power away to the community, to your teams, because in no way does it diminish you. It makes you grow even more as well. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody